7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts.
Portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls are here at DC's Museum of the Bible.
A fragment of Ecclesiastes that scholars had spent decades dating to around 150 BCE turns out to be closer to 300, which means the person who copied it may have been alive while the book was still being written. For almost 80 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls have been dated mostly by eye. Experts studied the shapes of the letters and estimated. It worked more or less, but there was almost nothing to check it against. Now 2 very different tools have been turned on the scrolls. One reads DNA out of the skins they are written on. The other is an AI trained on radiocarbon dates. Neither of them did what the internet says they did. And what they actually found is more interesting than the headline. Start with what the scrolls are. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds came across pottery jars in a cave near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. There were manuscripts inside. Over the following decade, archaeologists worked through 11 caves near a site called Qumran, in what is now the West Bank, and recovered roughly 25,000 fragments of parchment and papyrus. The remains around 1,000 of separate manuscripts, most of them hidden away around 70 CE. Some are the oldest surviving copies of biblical books anywhere, and there is the problem. 25,000 pieces, most of them small, many with no obvious partner. Working out which fragment belongs with which scroll has taken scholars the better part of a century, and a great deal of it came down to informed judgment. Dating worked the same way. The method is called paleography. You study how letter shapes drifted over time. You build a chronology out of that, and you place a manuscript on it by eye. It is a real skill. It is also close to circular. For most of that century, no independently dated manuscript existed to measure the chronology against. So in 2020, a team went after the parchment instead of the writing. Here is the part the headlines get wrong, and it matters. They did test DNA. It was not human DNA. The scrolls are written on animal skin, and skin carries the genome of the animal it came from. A team from Tel Aviv University, led by Oded Richavi and Noam Mizrahi, working with Matthias Jakobsen at Uppsala University and the Israel Antiquities Authority, spent years extracting ancient DNA from 26 scroll fragments, along with sandals, a garment and water skins from the same region. The work was published in the journal Cell in 2020. Nobody sequenced a scribe. They sequenced the sheep, which turns out to matter more than it sounds. If you can show that 2 fragments came from the same animal, or from 2 closely related animals, you have physical evidence that they belong to the same scroll. It is a way of sorting the jigsaw by something other than opinion. Almost every sample came back sheep. 2 did not. 2 fragments were made from cow skin, and both were from the book of Jeremiah. Cattle need grass and water. The Judean desert around Qumran has neither. So that cow skin was almost certainly not turned into parchment anywhere near those caves. It came from somewhere else, and somebody carried it in. One of the cowhide fragments had long been assumed to belong to the same Jeremiah scroll as a neighboring piece. The DNA said otherwise. The neighbor was sheep. They had never been the same scroll at all. And when scholars looked again at the text on the cowhide pieces, they found it carried a version of Jeremiah that differs from the one that came down to us. What that leaves is a collection that is not purely local. Some of what ended up in those caves was made elsewhere and brought in, which makes the library a wider snapshot than the writing of a single desert community. Now the second study, and it is worth being clear that this is a completely separate piece of work. Different team, different country, different question, different decade. The 2 get blended together online constantly, and they have very little to do with each other. This one is about time. In June 2025, a team led by Mladen Popovic, who heads the Qumran Institute at the University of Groningen, published their results in PLOS ONE. They had built an AI, and they named it Enoch, but before the AI, they had to fix the radiocarbon because there was a contamination problem that had never been properly dealt with. In the 1950s, the scholars handling the scrolls treated them with castor oil to make the faded text easier to read. Castor oil is a modern product, and modern oil soaked into ancient parchment drags a radiocarbon result toward the present, which makes a manuscript look younger than it really is. The team stripped it out and redated 30 manuscripts. Most were older than expected. Only 2 were younger. Then they built Enoch. 24 of those results were solid enough to train on, and from them the team produced 75 images of ink traces, each one typically holding 150 to 200 characters. They trained the model on 62 of them, held 13 back to test it, and had it learn how handwriting style tracked against a hard physical date. Then they turned it loose on 135 scrolls that had never been carbon dated at all. The point is not that a machine can read Hebrew. The point is that handwriting style was finally anchored to something measurable instead of to expert intuition. Enoch returns a date with an uncertainty of roughly 30 years, which in the window between 350 BCE is actually tighter than radiocarbon on its own, and the results ran older. Take 4Q114, a fragment holding chapters of the Book of Daniel. The radiocarbon came back with two possible windows. The one that matters runs from 230 to 160 BCE, decades earlier than the traditional paleographic classification had suggested, and the younger end of it runs right into the early 160s, which is when most scholars think the Book of Daniel was finished, or 4Q1009, a copy of Ecclesiastes. Paleographers had dated it to somewhere between 175 and 125 BCE. Enoch put it at 300 to 240 BCE. Most scholars think Ecclesiastes was composed by an anonymous writer during the 3rd century BCE. Read those two again because that is the payoff. Both manuscripts now land in the same window as the people thought to have composed the books they contain. Not a copy of a copy of a copy made centuries downstream. A copy made close to the source. That is the finding. Now the honest part, Enoch is not an oracle. Paleographers reviewed its 135 estimates and judged 79% of them realistic, which means roughly 1 in 5 they did not. The whole thing rests on a very small training set, 24 dated manuscripts, which the authors state plainly themselves. And it does not date when a text was composed. It dates the copy sitting in front of it. Popovich has been careful about this himself and has said plainly that the AI still needs human beings. There is also a knock-on effect that has nothing to do with religion at all. The old chronology assumed the Hasmonean script style gave way to the Herodian style one after the other. The new dates suggest the two overlapped, and that Herodian handwriting was already in use decades before Herod. If that holds, one of the main tools for dating this entire period gets blurrier, not sharper. So nobody sequenced the DNA of the people who wrote the Bible, and no AI decoded a hidden message. One study read the skins and found the library was not all made in one place. The other rebuilt the clock and found the copies are older than anyone thought, some of them old enough to sit alongside their own authors. There are around 1,000 of these manuscripts. Enoch has looked at 135,